Personality psychology asks the questions, what does it mean to be a person? How are we unique as individuals? And what is the nature of the self? Certain basic issues in the study of personality appear and reappear at different times and in different theories. These include, what is the importance of the unconscious? What is the self? To what extent can our approaches be nomothetic, which is concerned with universal laws, as opposed to idiographic, which is concerned with studying individual cases? What are the differences between men and women? And where do they come from? Which affects behavior more, the person or the situation? To what extent is personality culturally determined? Is personality a useful scientific concept or merely a convenient illusion? Modern personality theory began to take formal shape in the 1930s, thanks to the pioneering work of three men, Gordon Allport, Kurt Lewin, and Henry Murray. In 1937, Allport defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychological systems that determine his unique adjustment to his environment. Lewin's approach was also dynamic, as he looked for systems that underlie observable behavior. In 1935, Lewin drew attention to the momentary condition of the individual and the structure of the psychological situation. Murray believed in a comprehensive orientation that included longitudinal research, which is a technique that involves studying the same people over time. He took a very broad approach to personality, defining it as the brand of psychology which principally concerns itself with the study of human lives and the factors which influence their course and which investigates individual differences. Around the same time as Lewin's theories during the 1930s, Margaret Mead demonstrated that personality was heavily influenced by culture, but her work was not fully appreciated at that time. Some of the more current definitions of personality include Weiner's definition, which he said was a description of what people are like and how they're likely to think, feel, and act. And Funder said personality is an individual's characteristic pattern of thought, emotion, and behavior, together with the psychological mechanisms, hidden or not, behind those patterns. Think about which of these definitions make the most sense to you. Why is that the case? A person's personality can be thought of as one's unique constellation of relatively stable psychological forces. These forces include a person's cognition, drives or motives, and their emotions, traits, and behaviors. These forces develop through biological maturation, social learning, as well as developmental interactions. In an effort to orient us a bit as we dive into a large area of study, let's review the basic components of personality. The structure of personality involves the basic ingredients of a person. That is, how do we describe a person? Are they funny or serious? Rigid or easygoing? The dynamics examine how these basic ingredients interact. How does being an introvert interact with growing up in a rural area? How about being an extrovert and growing up in an adopted family who prefer peace and quiet? To what degree do our environment and genetics interact? We will also seek out certain environments based on our personalities. The development of personality involves looking at how these qualities develop over time. Throughout our childhood and adulthood, do our personalities develop in response to significant life events, both good and bad? And change looks at how flexible this person is in terms of being open to change. For our purposes, we will define personality as the scientific study of the psychological forces that make people uniquely themselves. Central to this class will be two purposes to personality psychology that we will continue to return to. The first is understanding the whole person. This means looking at individual traits, but also understanding how these traits interact to form a person. The what and the why. We will look at structure, drives and motives, the conscious and unconscious, and all these factors that work together. The second is to determine the basic ways in which people differ from each other. Personality psychology answers these questions in terms of systematic observations and scientific inference to test theories about how and why individuals behave as they do, with a focus on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of real people. Techniques range from the most formal mathematical assessment of traits and abilities, such as correlation coefficients, to the careful, rich examination of a single individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors through case studies. Your textbook outlines personality into 8 approaches or aspects, which together help us understand the very complex nature of the individual. We will review these now, but know that the basis of this class is to look at each of these in depth. For now, I'll give you a teaser. The first is a psychoanalytic approach or unconscious aspects to personality. This pays special attention to unconscious influences and puts importance on sexual drives, even in non-sexual spheres of life. Think Freud and what you've heard, in psychology classes or popular culture, about the tendency of humans to seek out partners similar to their mothers or fathers. This approach to personality argues that there is way more than what meets the eye. In fact, we're often acting out of motives and desires that we don't even know are there. Why do you like certain things or foods? Why are you attracted to your boyfriend or girlfriend? Many psychoanalysts would argue that you can't answer that question because on a conscious level, you don't know. The neo-analytic or ego approach emphasizes one sense of identity. Personality is formed from our sense of self in relation to other individuals and social contextual factors, such as societal constraints. Think Jung, Adler, and Horney. Biological approaches to personality are just as they sound. Our personalities come in part from our unique genetic makeups. Our very own temperamental natures come from our physiological makeup, like our genetics, physiology, and hormones. We don't respond to our environment in a passive way. Our traits determine how we respond to our environment. Behaviorism approaches reject ideas of internal traits, tendencies, defensives, and motivations. Instead, they see people as absolutely controlled by their environments and focus only on observable behavior that can be measured. Watson was the pioneer of this approach. People think about and try to understand the world around them. This fact is so important that all personality theories attempt to take it into account. However, cognitive approaches view perception and cognition as the core of what it means to be a person. The way people interpret their environment is seen as central to their humanness, and the ways in which people differ from one another and how they do this is seen as central to their individuality. Lewin was one of the first theorists in the cognitive approach. The trait approach seems to be the most common personality theory in popular culture. We can easily describe people as extroverted or conscientious or selfish. But for a trait approach to succeed, we need a relatively small number of traits to account for a person's consistencies. And these traits don't apply to everyone, which can be challenging. Allport, Jung, and Cattell all dabbled in the trait approach. The existential approach is concerned with the meaning of human existence. It focuses on an idea called being in the world, which is the idea that the self cannot exist without a world, and the world cannot exist without a person being able to perceive it. This approach is not tuned to uncovering logical inconsistencies or rationalizations. For example, take the cases of religion, belief in the afterlife, and anxiety about death. This approach doesn't consider why we think this way, but that we think this way. Ethical and spiritual matters are neither to be ignored nor explained away in this approach. On the other hand, the humanistic approach is a philosophical movement that emphasizes the personal worth of the individual and the centrality of human values. This approach is based on the complex foundation of existentialism. Maslow is one of the big proponents of these approaches. And finally, the interactionist approach attempts to address the fact that people change their behavior from situation to situation. This theory helps to explain why some people may feel introverted in some settings, such as the classroom, but extroverted around old friends. This difference in behavior in the same person shows how personality and the situation interact, and people will express their personality in different ways in different situations. Sullivan and Mead push this theory forward. A thorough understanding of personality involves a firm grasp of the meaning, validity, and implications of these various perspectives. For instance, why does a certain 18-year-old high school senior seem consumed by intrusive thoughts and sexual fantasies? Is it hormones, repressed sexual drives, the influence of the surroundings, past experiences and conditioning, an existential crisis, combinations of these or other personal influences? We need to think about this person from various perspectives to get a deeper understanding of their personality and behavior. There are many different aspects and personality approaches to keep in mind as we approach this class with critical eyes. You may have already noticed that inherent within what I just went over are some contradictions. I want you to think about these contradictions or tensions that you are already picking up on thus far. Many of these aspects of personality are fundamentally arguing different things: nature versus nurture, free will versus determinism. We will look at all these tensions, and rather than ignore them, let's embrace them and use them as a basis for discussion. And most importantly, understand that these theories don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can pick from them like spices on a rack to form a recipe that makes sense to us for explanations of personality. All I ask that you do in this class is understand where these theories come from and what they are. You don't have to buy them. Just know them so we can discuss them. Personality theories arise from various sources. They come from careful observation and from deep introspection, from systematic measurement and from statistical analyses, from biological brain scans and from studies of mental illness, and from anthropology and sociology and economics and philosophy. Theories apply these insights to a psychological understanding of the individual. We need to distinguish between reductionist and pluralist approaches when using these theories to explain personality. Reductionist approaches use one single theory to explain aspects of personality, whereas pluralist approaches use pieces of multiple theories to give a comprehensive explanation of personality. I want you to use the pluralist method when evaluating personality in this class in order to develop a complete understanding of personality from multiple angles. Likewise, we need to distinguish between nomothetic and idiographic approaches. Nomothetic approaches seek to generate universal laws that will apply to most people or most situations. On the other hand, idiographic approaches seek to explain one individual or situation. So, for example, a nomothetic approach will look at how people's personality development is impacted by childhood trauma. An idiographic approach will look at how one particular person's personality development was impacted by their specific childhood trauma. In this class, we will look at several details that compose personality. For instance, what are the basic units of personality? Are they our traits, like extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeableness? Or are they our thoughts and motives? We will also compare the differences between the structure and process of personality, the differences across genders, the debate between nature and nurture, and how these two things interact, and whether we actually have free will or if our behavior is determined. Finally, we will look at the different ways we can measure personality. I want to talk about the differences between deductive and inductive approaches to understanding personality. Deductive or top-down approaches mean that conclusions are drawn from psychological laws or theories, whereas inductive or bottom-up approaches mean that conclusions are drawn from data and observations. For example, Freud developed psychoanalytic theories about behavior and how they relate to unconscious motives. He then used these theories to explain people's problems. He was using a deductive approach. On the other hand, Pavlov trained dogs to salivate when they heard a bell. He did this by pairing the sound of the bell with food. He used these observations of his dogs to develop his theory of classical conditioning. He was using an inductive approach. In sum, personality psychology addresses some of the interesting yet complex questions involved in understanding what it means to be a human being. As Gordon Allport put it, all books on personality psychology are at the same time books on the philosophy of what is a person.